In the sleepy village of Ashby Green, where roses bloom and secrets fester, a storm of poison pen letters unleashes chaos, accusing neighbours of shameful sins. When Clara Henshaw's suicide is revealed as cold-blooded murder, the idyllic facade crumbles. Enter Miss Jane Marple, a quiet spinster with a razor-sharp mind, unravelling a web of deceit, debts, and deadly motives. As suspicion poisons every heart, one question burns. Who wields the quill that kills? Dive into a tale of betrayal and truth where no one is what they seem. Chapter 1. The first letters, Ashby Green, was the sort of village that seemed to have stepped out of a pastoral painting. Its charm so deliberate it might have been arranged for a postcard. Cottages with ivy-clad walls and roses spilling over garden, gates lined its narrow lanes. The church, a squat Norman structure with a lopsided steeple, stood at the heart of the village, its graveyard a silent chronicle of centuries. Beyond, the green hills rolled gently, dotted with sheep that grazed under the watchful eye of an ancient oak. It was a place where time seemed to pause, where the modern world intruded only in the hum of a distant tractor or the occasional motor car rattling over the cobbled bridge. To an outsider, Ashby Green promised peace. To me, Robert Langley, it promised recovery. I had come to Ashby Green in the spring of 1945, a journalist grounded by a leg injury sustained when my plane took a hit over the Channel. The war had left me with a limp and a weariness that no doctor could cure. So I'd leased Rose Cottage for 6 months, hoping the quiet would mend what London could not. My sister Edith, 3 years my senior, and possessed of a practical nature that bordered on stubborn, insisted on joining me. "You'll starve or fall into a ditch without me," she'd said, her tone brooking no argument. Edith was not one for sentiment, but her decision to leave her comfortable flat in Cheltenham spoke of a loyalty she'd never voice aloud. Rose Cottage was a low, whitewashed building with a thatched roof that sagged like an old man's hat. Its windows were small, their panes wavy with age, and the garden was a tangle of lavender and hollyhocks that buzzed with bees. Inside, the rooms were dim, the beams blackened by time, and the furniture sturdy but worn, as if it had borne the weight of countless tenants. Edith took to it at once, scrubbing floors and airing linens with a vigour that made me feel useless. I spent my days reading or limping to the village green, where I'd sit on a bench and watch Ashby Green unfold its daily rituals. The postman cycling past, the children chasing a hoop, the women gossiping outside the grocer's. It was a world, apart from the chaos I'd known, and yet, beneath its serenity, I sensed an undercurrent, a watchfulness in the glances exchanged across garden walls. The first hint of trouble came on a Tuesday morning, when the dew still clung to the grass, and the air carried the scent of freshly baked bread from the village tea-room. I was in the parlour, struggling with a crossword, when Edith appeared, her face tight with something between anger and embarrassment. In her hand was an envelope, cheap and slightly creased, as if it had been handled roughly. "This was under the door," she said, tossing it onto the table. Her voice was sharp, but her fingers lingered on the edge of the table, betraying unease. I picked up the envelope. It bore no stamp, no address, only Edith's name typed in uneven letters. Inside was a single sheet of thin paper, the words typed. In the same jagged hand, Edith Langley, you think yourself so proper, but we know the truth. You've been casting eyes at men who aren't yours, haven't you?" The accusation was crude, almost childish in its malice, but it stung. Edith, at 42, was a woman of unyielding propriety, her life devoted to her work as a librarian, before she'd come to care for me. The idea of her flirting, let alone with married men, was absurd. "It's nonsense," I said, folding the letter. "Some village prankster with too much time." Edith's lips thinned. "It's spiteful, Robert, and it's not a child's work. Look at the typing." She pointed to the uneven letters, some smudged, others misaligned. This was done on a machine, an old one, I'd wager. I tried to lighten her mood. "Perhaps it's a rival librarian, jealous of your cataloguing skills." She didn't smile. "Burn it," she said, turning to the kitchen. But I slipped the letter into my pocket, sensing it was more than a joke. Edith's pride was bruised, and I knew she'd brood over it, though she'd never admit it. By noon, word of similar letters had spread through Ashby Green like a fever. At the post office, a cramped shop smelling of ink and paraffin, I overheard Mrs. Fowler, the grocer's wife, whispering to a customer, "Mr. Tate got one, you know. The vicar called him a thief, stealing from the collection plate. Can you imagine?" Her voice was gleeful, her eyes bright with the thrill of scandal. Mrs. Fowler was a stout woman with a penchant for gossip, her apron perpetually dusted with flour, and I suspected she relished the drama more than she'd admit. I bought a packet of envelopes, lingering to listen. The customer, a thin woman with a pinched face, lowered her voice. "And Mrs. Henshaw. At the tea-room she had one too. Something about her prices being a swindle. She's furious, says it's lies." Mrs. Henshaw, I knew, was Clara Henshaw, a widow whose tea-room was the village's social hub, its tables always crowded with women sipping tea and dissecting local news. As I left the post office, I passed the vicarage, a red brick house half hidden by yew trees. Mr. Tate, a mild-mannered man with spectacles and a stoop, was in his garden, clipping roses with a distracted air. I nodded to him, but his smile was strained, and I wondered what his letter had said. The poison pen, it seemed, spared no one. That afternoon, I limped to the village green, where the air was warm and the grass hummed with insects. A group of children played near the war memorial, their laughter sharp against the quiet. On a bench sat an elderly woman, her white hair tucked under a straw hat, her hands busy with knitting. She looked up as I approached, her eyes pale blue and startlingly alert. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice soft but clear. "You must be Mr. Langley, the new tenant at Rose Cottage." I was surprised. "You have the advantage of me, I'm afraid." She smiled, a small knowing curve of her lips. "I am Jane Marple, visiting my niece Margaret at the vicarage. Villages are small places, Mr. Langley. News travels quickly." Her tone was gentle, but her gaze was sharp, as if she saw more than she let on. I'd heard of Miss Marple from Edith, who'd met her at a church tea, and described her as deceptively clever, like a librarian with a detective's mind. I sat beside her, grateful for the rest. "You've chosen a lively time to visit," I said. "The village is in a stir over some letters." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "Oh, yes, the letters. Nasty things, aren't they? I've heard of them already. Poor Mr. Tate is quite upset, and Mrs. Henshaw too. Such accusations." do more harm than people realize. I hesitated, then told her about Edith's letter, omitting the details but sharing its tone. Miss Marple listened, her expression unchanging, but I sensed her mind working. "Typed, you say?" she mused. "That's interesting. Not handwritten, which might be easier to trace. A typewriter suggests someone cautious, perhaps with access to an older machine. The vicarage has one, I believe, in the study." I was taken aback. "You think the vicar—" "Oh, no, no," she said, her laugh like the chime of a small bell. "Mr. Tate is far too gentle for such malice. But typewriters are not so common in a village like this. It's worth noting, don't you think?" Her words stayed with me as I returned to Rose Cottage. Edith was in the garden, weeding with a ferocity that suggested she was still smarting from the letter. I didn't mention Miss Marple's observation, not wanting to fuel her unease, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the letters were only the beginning. The next day brought more revelations. At the tea-room, a cosy room with chintz curtains and the scent of scones, I saw Clara Henshaw, her face pale but composed. She served me tea with a steady hand, but her eyes darted to the door as if expecting another letter. "It's a disgrace," she said when I asked about the gossip. "Calling me a cheat after all I do for this village. I've half a mind to find the culprit myself. I liked Clara. She was in her 50s, with greying hair and a brisk manner that hid a kind heart. Her tea-room was a refuge for Ashby Green, and I couldn't imagine her swindling anyone." "Have you seen the letter?" I asked. She shook her head. "I burned it, didn't want it in my house. But it was typed like the others, and full of lies." Her voice trembled, and I saw the toll the letter had taken. As I left the tea-room, I passed Dr. Morton, the village physician, a tall man with a tired face and a habit of rubbing his hands together. He nodded curtly, his thoughts elsewhere. I wondered if he'd received a letter too, or if his distraction was due to the village's unrest. His sister, Helen Morton, lived with him, a woman known for her charm, but also her reserve. And I'd seen her at the tea-room, chatting with Clara. Could she know something? By evening, Ashby Green was alight with speculation. At the Dog and Whistle, the village pub, I heard fragments of conversation. "Ned Carter's behind it, mark my words. That boy's always been trouble." "No, it's someone older, someone who knows everyone's secrets." Ned Carter was a farmhand, barely 20, with a sullen demeanour and a reputation for petty theft. I'd seen him loitering near the church, his cap pulled low, but I couldn't picture him typing letters. Edith, meanwhile, had taken to locking our doors at night, a habit she'd never had in Cheltenham. "It's not just the letters," she said over supper, her stew untouched. "It's the way people look at you now, wondering if the accusations are true. Whoever's doing this wants to tear us apart." I thought of Miss Marple, her calm observation about the typewriter. She'd said little, but her words carried weight, like pebbles dropped in a still pond. Ashby Green, for all its beauty, was no longer a haven. The poison pen had struck, and I feared its venom would spread further before it was stopped. That night, as I lay in bed, the wind rattling the cottage windows, I heard a faint rustle outside. I limped to the door, my heart pounding, but found nothing, only the shadow of the oak tree swaying in the moonlight. yet I couldn't shake the sense that someone had been there, watching, waiting. The letters were only the beginning, and Ashby Green was on the brink of something darker. Chapter 2. A Death in the Village. The sun rose over Ashby Green with a deceptive gentleness, its light gilding the rooftops and casting long shadows across the dew-soaked lanes. To an outsider, the village might have seemed untouched, its beauty a quiet rebuke to the turmoil of the wider world. But for those of us who called it home, even temporarily, the morning brought a chill that had nothing to do with the spring air. Clara Henshaw was dead, and the news of her passing spread through Ashby Green like ink spilling across a page. I, Robert Langley, had woken early, my leg aching from the damp. Rose Cottage was silent, save for the faint clatter of Edith in the kitchen, her movements brisker than usual, as if she could outpace the unease that had settled over us since the poison pen letters began. I was at the window, watching a blackbird peck at the lawn, when the church bell tolled. Not the usual call to service, but a slow, mournful knell. My stomach tightened. In a village like Ashby Green, such a sound meant only one thing. Edith appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. "That's for Clara Henshaw," she said, her voice flat, but her eyes troubled. "Mrs. Fowler stopped by at dawn. Found dead in her parlour last night, they say. Sleeping pills." I turned from the window, the blackbird forgotten. Clara? Dead? But I saw her yesterday pouring tea as if nothing was wrong. Clara Henshaw's tea-room had been a haven, its warmth a contrast to the venom of the letters. The thought of her gone was jarring, like a note struck off-key. "They're saying she took her own life," Edith continued, folding her arms. "A letter was found with her, one of those wretched typed ones. Accused her of carrying on with a man, someone married. Mrs. Fowler says Clara was distraught." I shook my head, disbelief warring with a growing unease. Clara didn't strike me as the sort to crumble under gossip. She was upset about the letter, yes, but suicidal? That doesn't fit. Edith's lips pursed. People hide their pain. "Robert! You, of all people, should know that." Her words carried a sting, a reminder of my own struggles since the war, but I let it pass. Edith was shaken, and her sharpness was her shield. I pulled on my coat and limped to the village, needing to see for myself. The green was quieter than usual, the children absent, the benches empty. A small crowd had gathered outside the tea-room, its curtains drawn, the sign on the door turned to "Closed." Mrs. Fowler stood at the forefront, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "It's a tragedy, that's what it is. Poor Clara, driven to it by that vile letter. Whoever's writing them ought to be ashamed." Beside her was Mr. Tate, the vicar, his spectacles fogged with emotion. "We must pray for her soul," he said. But his words lacked conviction, as if he doubted prayer could mend the fracture in Ashby Green's heart. I caught his eye, and he nodded, but his gaze slid away, as if he feared I'd ask about his own letter. I edged closer to the tea-room, hoping for a glimpse inside, but the door was locked, and a constable, a young man with a nervous air, stood guard. "No one's to go in," he said, his voice firm but his hands fidgeting. "Coroner's orders." I retreated to the churchyard, where the air was cooler, the yews casting dappled shade. There, on a bench, sat Miss Jane Marple, her knitting a soft rhythm against the silence. She looked up as I approached, her pale blue eyes as sharp as ever, though her expression was grave. "Mr. Langley," she said, "I see you've heard the sad news about Mrs. Henshaw." I sat beside her, grateful for her calm. "It's hard to believe," I said. "They're saying suicide, but I can't make sense of it. Clara seemed so steady." Miss Marple's needles paused, then resumed. "Steady people can be fragile in ways others don't see," she said. "But I agree. It's puzzling. I knew Clara only slightly through my niece Margaret, but she struck me as a woman of resilience. To end her life over a letter, well, it raises questions, doesn't it?" Her tone was mild, but I sensed a mind at work, sifting through details, like a gardener turning soil. "You think there's more to it?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "I think, Mr. Langley, that we must keep our eyes open. Suicide is a conclusion, not a fact, until we know all the pieces." "Tell me, what did the letter say, the one found with her?" I hesitated, reluctant to repeat gossip, but Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Mrs. Fowler said it accused Clara of an affair with a married man, something scandalous enough to push her to despair, or so they think." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. "An affair? How convenient for the letter-writer to choose a sin so private, so hard to disprove. And typed like the others, I presume?" "Yes," I said, recalling Clara's words about burning her first letter. "The constable mentioned it was typed, found on her table beside the pill bottle." "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "A typed letter, left in plain sight. One might almost think it was meant to be found." Her words hung in the air, and I felt a chill, as if a door had opened to a possibility I hadn't considered. The village was restless that day, its rhythm disrupted. At the Dog and Whistle, the pub's dark interior was thick with smoke and speculation. I stopped for a pint, hoping to overhear something useful. The landlord, Mr. Gibbs, a burly man with a scarred hand, leaned over the bar, his voice low. "Clara Henshaw, of all people! Never thought she'd do such a thing. But those letters, they get under your skin." A group of farmers at a corner table muttered about Ned Carter, the farmhand whose sullen presence had made him a scapegoat. "He's got a temper," one said, "and he was always hanging about the tea-room, eyeing Clara's takings." I'd seen Ned myself, his cap pulled low, his hands in his pockets, but I couldn't picture him crafting letters. He seemed more likely to throw a punch than type a sentence. Others pointed to Miss Lydia Brent, the seamstress who lived in a cottage on the village's edge. "She's odd, that one," said a woman with a basket of eggs. "Keeps to herself, but she sees everything. Bet she's got a typewriter hidden away." Lydia was a tall, angular woman with a sharp tongue, and I'd noticed her at church, her eyes scanning the congregation as if tallying sins. But suspicion wasn't evidence. Dr. Morton passed through the pub, his face drawn, his coat rumpled. He'd been called to the tea-room the night before, I learned, to confirm Clara's death. "Nothing I could do," he said to Mr. Gibbs, his voice heavy. "She was gone before I got there." His sister, Helen Morton, wasn't with him, but I recalled her closeness to Clara, their heads bent together at the tea-room. Helen was a striking woman, her charm tempered by a guarded air, and I wondered what she made of this loss. Back at Rose Cottage, Edith was subdued, her earlier sharpness replaced by a quiet grief. "Clara was kind to me when we arrived," she said, setting out tea. "She didn't deserve this." I told her about Miss Marple's comment, the idea that the letter was meant to be found, and Edith frowned. "You think someone wanted it to look like suicide? That's a terrible thought." "It's only a thought," I said, but I couldn't shake it. Clara's death felt staged, like a scene from a play, and the letter was a prop, too neatly placed. I resolved to visit the tea room's assistant, Sarah, a young woman who'd worked for Clara. Perhaps she'd seen something. The next morning, I found Sarah at the church, arranging flowers for Clara's memorial. She was barely 20, with a nervous habit of twisting her apron. "It doesn't seem real," she said, her eyes red. "Mrs. Henshaw was good to me, never cross, even when I broke a teapot. Why would she do it?" I asked about the night Clara died. Sarah hesitated, then said, "She was quiet, more than usual. Kept looking at the door, like she expected someone. I left at 6, and she was locking up. That's all I know." "Did anyone visit her?" I pressed. "Anyone out of the ordinary?" Clara bit her lip. "Miss Helen was there earlier, bringing back a tray she'd borrowed. They talked for a bit, but I didn't hear what about. And Ned Carter came by, asking for work, but Mrs. Henshaw sent him off." I thanked her and left, the names circling in my mind. Helen Morton with her private talks, Ned Carter with his loitering, and the letter typed and deliberate. I stopped by the vicarage to see Miss Marple, hoping her clarity could cut through the fog. She was in the garden, pruning roses with a pair of small shears. "Mr. Langley," she said, "you look troubled. Is it Mrs. Henshaw's death?" Told her what Sarah had said, and Miss Marple listened, her hands still. "A visitor, and a letter left for all to see," she said. "In my experience, Mr. Langley, people who take their own lives are often more private about their pain. This feels arranged. And the poison pen letters, they're part of it, I'm sure. They create a climate of fear, don't they? A perfect cover for something else." "Something else?" I asked, my pulse quickening. She smiled, but her eyes were serious. "We must watch and wait. The truth has a way of showing itself, if one is patient. But I'd be curious to know more about that typewriter. The vicarage has one, as I mentioned, but so does the village hall, I believe, and Dr. Morton's surgery might too. Typewriters are not so rare, but a faulty one. Now, that's worth finding." Her words lingered as I walked home. The village was hushed, the air heavy with unspoken questions. At the green, I saw Ned Carter, his shoulders hunched, kicking at a stone. He glanced up, his eyes defiant, and I wondered what secrets he carried. Further on, Helen Morton crossed the lane, her face pale, a basket of flowers in her arms. She nodded but didn't stop, and I felt a pang of suspicion. That evening, another letter arrived at Rose Cottage, slipped under the door as silently as the first. It was for me this time. "Robert Langley, you're not the hero you pretend to be. What are you hiding behind that limp?" The words were typed, the T slanting left, just as Miss Marple had noted. I showed it to Edith, who paled but said nothing. We burned it, but its venom lingered, a reminder that the poison pen was still at work. Ashby Green was no longer a refuge. Clara's death had cracked its facade, and the letters were a poison seeping through the cracks. I thought of Miss Marple, her quiet certainty, and knew she was right. This was no simple suicide. Something darker was at play, and I feared we'd see more of it before the truth came to light. Chapter 3. Suspicions. Mount the days following Clara Henshaw's death draped Ashby Green in a shroud of unease, as if the village itself held its breath, wary of what might come next. The spring sunlight, so bright and forgiving, seemed at odds with the shadows that lingered in doorways and whispered conversations. The poison pen letters, once dismissed as spiteful pranks, had taken on a sinister weight, their typed words now linked to a tragedy that none could ignore. I, Robert Langley, found myself caught in the village's restless tide, my journalist's curiosity sharpened by a growing sense that Clara's death was not the simple suicide it appeared. Rose Cottage, our temporary haven, felt less like a sanctuary now. Edith, my sister, had grown quieter, her usual brisk efficiency tempered by a wariness that showed in the way she double-checked the locks each night. The letter I'd received, accusing me of hiding behind my war injury, had shaken her more than she admitted. She'd burned it without a word, but I'd salvaged a fragment, noting the slanted T that Miss Marple had mentioned. That small detail, like a crack in a wall, hinted at something larger, and I resolved to learn more. The village was a cauldron of suspicion, its residents turning on one another with a speed that was both startling and oddly predictable. At the grocer's, where the air smelled of apples and wax, I overheard Mrs. Fowler, her voice a conspiratorial hiss, pinning the blame on Ned Carter. "That boy's got no morals," she said to a customer, her hands busy with a scale. "Always skulking about stealing apples from my stall. I'd wager he's got a typewriter stashed somewhere, just to make trouble." Ned, with his sullen demeanour and restless energy, was an easy target, but I wasn't convinced. His anger seemed too raw, too uncalculated for the cold malice of the letters. Others pointed to Miss Lydia Brent, the seamstress whose cottage stood apart, its windows dark even in daylight. "She's always watching," said Mr. Gibbs, the pub landlord, as I passed the Dog and Whistle. "Knows more than she lets on, that one. Bet she's typing those letters to settle old scores." Lydia's sharp tongue and solitary habits made her a figure of intrigue, but I'd seen her at the tea-room once, her fingers deft with a needle, her expression more weary than vengeful. Still, the village's whispers were relentless, and I wondered what truths they might obscure. I decided to seek out Miss Jane Marple, whose quiet presence at the vicarage had already proven more insightful than the village's clamour. I found her in the churchyard, seated on a bench beneath a yew tree, her knitting a steady counterpoint to the distant bleating of sheep. Her straw hat cast a shadow across her face, but her eyes, pale and piercing, missed nothing. "Mr. Langley," she said, her voice soft as ever, "you've come with questions, I expect. Ashby Green is not itself, is it?" I sat beside her, the stone bench cool through my trousers. "It's like a fever," I said. "Everyone's pointing fingers, but no one's got proof. Ned Carter, Lydia Brent, even Dr. Morton's name came up at the pub. They say he's been careless with his prescriptions." Miss Marple's needles clicked, a rhythm as precise as a metronome. "Dr. Morton," she mused. "A tired man, I think, carrying more burdens than he shows. But carelessness is not the same as malice. Tell me, what do the villagers say about the letters themselves? Any patterns?" I thought back to the fragments I'd heard. They're all typed like Clara's, and they're personal, accusing people of secrets they'd rather keep hidden. Ned's letter called him a thief. Lydia's hinted at some old scandal. Mine? I hesitated, then pressed on. Mine said I'm hiding something, faking my limp. Miss Marple's gaze flickered to my leg, but there was no pity in it, only curiosity. How interesting, she said. The writer chooses accusations that wound, yet are vague enough to avoid proof. It's clever, in a cruel way. And the typewriter, have you noticed anything about it? The slanted T, I said, recalling her earlier comment. It's on every letter I've seen or heard about. You mentioned the vicarage typewriter and the village hall. Could it be one of those? Perhaps, she said, her tone non-committal. But we mustn't rush to conclusions. Typewriters are private things, often kept in studies or offices. The vicarage has one, yes, but so does Dr. Morton's surgery, I'm told. And the village hall's machine is used for parish notices, accessible to many. We need more than a slanted letter to find our writer. Her words were a reminder of her method. Patient, deliberate, like a spider weaving a web. I admired it, but my impatience got the better of me. What about Clara's death? I asked. You said it felt arranged. Do you think the letters and her death are connected? Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked out across the graveyard, where moss-covered stones leaned like tired sentinels. I think, Mr. Langley, that Clara Henshaw's death is the heart of this matter. The letters began before she died, sowing discord, creating a stage. Her letter, left so prominently, feels like a prop, meant to explain her death as despair. But despair is not always what it seems. We must look at those closest to her, those who knew her habits, her heart. Her words sent a shiver through me. I thought of Helen Morton, Dr. Morton's sister, who'd been Clara's friend. Sarah, the tea-room assistant, had mentioned Helen's visit the day Clara died. Could Helen know something? Or was I, like the village, grasping at shadows? I decided to observe the suspects myself. That afternoon, I limped to the village hall, a low building with peeling paint and a notice board cluttered with parish announcements. The hall was empty, save for Mrs. Tate, the vicar's wife, who was arranging chairs for a Women's Institute meeting. She was a plump woman with a nervous smile, her hands fluttering as she spoke. "Oh, Mr. Langley, it's dreadful, isn't it? Poor Clara, and those letters, my husband's still shaken." I nodded, glancing at the typewriter on a table in the corner. It was an old model, its keys worn, and I itched to test it. "Do many people use this?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. Mrs. Tate frowned. "Not often. Mr. Tate types his sermons, sometimes, and I do the parish newsletter. It's a finicky thing, jams if you're not careful." I made a mental note to return when the hall was empty, to check for the slanted DT. Next, I passed Dr. Morton's surgery, a narrow house, with a brass plate by the door. Through the window, I saw him with a patient, his face etched with fatigue. Helen Morton was in the garden, pruning roses, her movements precise, but her expression distant. She looked up, and our eyes met for a moment before she turned away. There was something guarded in her, a tension I couldn't place. Ned Carter was harder to find, but I spotted him near the church, leaning against a wall, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He straightened as I approached, his eyes narrowing. "What do you want?" he said, his voice rough. "Just walking," I said, keeping my tone light. "Heard you got a letter like the rest of us." His jaw tightened. "None of your business. Whoever wrote it's a coward, hiding behind a machine." He flicked his cigarette away and stalked off, but his anger felt genuine, not the calculated cruelty of the poison pen. That evening, I joined Edith at the vicarage for a small gathering, a belated welcome for Miss Marple's niece, Margaret. The vicarage was a rambling house, its rooms filled with faded rugs and bookshelves sagging under the weight of theology. Margaret was a cheerful woman, younger than I'd expected, with a laugh that eased the room's tension. But the shadow of Clara's death lingered, and conversation turned inevitably to the letters. Mr. Tate, pouring tea, spoke quietly. "It's a test of our faith, these accusations. Mine called me a fraud, unfit to lead. I try to forgive, but it's hard." His wife patted his arm, but her eyes darted to Miss Marple as if seeking reassurance. Helen Morton was there, her charm subdued, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. "Clara didn't deserve this," she said, her voice catching. "She was a friend, always kind. I can't believe she'd—" She trailed off, and I wondered if her grief was tinged with guilt. Miss Marple, seated by the fire, listened more than she spoke, her knitting a constant in her lap. But when Mrs. Fowler, who'd arrived late, began speculating about Lydia Brent, Miss Marple interjected. "Miss Brent is solitary, yes, but solitude is not a crime. We must be careful not to let fear cloud our judgment. The letters are meant to divide us, to make us doubt one another. That, I think, is their true purpose." Her words silenced the room, and I saw a flicker of unease in Helen's eyes. Was it my imagination, or did she grip her handkerchief tighter? I resolved to watch her closely, and to check the village hall typewriter as soon as possible. The next morning, I slipped into the hall during a quiet hour, the air thick with dust and the scent of old wood. The typewriter was still there, its keys gleaming faintly in the light. I typed a quick sentence, "The quick fox jumps," and examined the result. The T slanted left, unmistakably, just like the letters. My heart raced. This was a clue, but the hall was public, used by many. Anyone could have sat at this desk, their fingers tapping out venom. I hid the paper in my pocket and left, passing Lydia Brent's cottage on my way home. Her garden was overgrown, her curtains drawn, but a faint light glowed inside, as if she were working late. I thought of knocking, but something held me back. Lydia was an enigma, and I needed more than village gossip to understand her. At Rose Cottage, Edith was sorting letters, not the poison kind, but bills and notes from friends. "Any more of those awful things?" she asked, her tone sharp. "N'était shan't. Today," I said, but I showed her the typed sample from the hall. "This matches the letters. The machine's in the village hall, but it doesn't narrow it down much." Edith frowned. "It's someone who knows us, Robert. Someone who walks these lanes, smiles at us, then types those lies. I don't like it." Neither did I. The village was a maze of secrets, and Clara's death was its dark centre. Miss Marple's words echoed in my mind. The letters were a stage, a distraction, but from what? I thought of Helen, her guarded glances, Ned, his raw anger, Lydia, her watchful solitude, and Dr. Morton, whose weariness might hide more than overwork. That night, as I lay in bed, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows like an impatient guest. I dreamed of a typewriter, its keys clattering in the dark, each stroke a wound. When I woke, the village was silent, but the weight of suspicion pressed heavier than ever. Ashby Green was unravelling, and I feared the poison pen would strike again before Miss Marple's web caught its prey. Chapter 4. Another letter strikes. The spring days in Ashby Green, once bright with promise, had taken on a brittle edge, as if the village's charm were a fragile veneer stretched taut over a well of secrets. Clara Henshaw's death, ruled a suicide but shadowed by doubt, had left a wound that festered with each whispered accusation, each sidelong glance. The poison pen letters, with their jagged type and venomous intent, had become a spectre, haunting doorways and dreams alike. I, Robert Langley, felt the weight of them keenly, my journalist's instinct urging me to unravel the truth, even as my war-weary mind longed for the peace I'd sought in this quiet hamlet. Rose Cottage, where my sister Edith and I had settled, was no longer a refuge. The creak of its old beams, once comforting, now seemed to echo the village's unease. Edith, ever practical, had thrown herself into routine, polishing silver, tending the garden. But her eyes betrayed her. The letters had touched us both, their accusations like thorns lodged under the skin. My own, hinting at deceit behind. My limp had been followed by the discovery of the village hall typewriter. Its slanted T a tantalizing clue, yet it led nowhere definitive, for the hall was open to all, its machine a tool for parish notices, and perhaps malice. It was a Thursday morning, the air heavy with the scent of lilacs, when the next letter arrived. I was in the parlour, my leg propped on a stool, attempting to read a novel, but distracted by thoughts of Clara's death. Edith burst in, her face pale, a cheap envelope clutched in her hand. "Another one," she said, her voice tight. "Found it on the mat just now. It's for me." I took the envelope, its paper thin and slightly damp, as if it had been slipped under the door in the early hours. Edith's name was typed in uneven letters, the same jagged style we'd come to dread. I slit it open, and the words inside were as cruel as I'd feared. "Edith Langley, your prim airs fool no one." What shameful secrets do you whisper to the vicar in those private chats? The accusation was absurd. Edith's talks with Mr. Tate were about church flowers, nothing more. But its specificity chilled me. The writer knew her movements, her habits. Edith sank into a chair, her hands trembling. "This is worse than the first," she said. "It's not just spite. It's as if they're watching me. How do they know I've spoken to Mr. Tate?" I examined the letter, noting the slanted T that matched the village hall typewriter. "They're clever," I said, trying to sound calm. "They pick details that sound intimate, but could be guessed from observation. You've been to the vicarage often enough." Edith's eyes flashed. "Guessed? Robert, this feels personal. Someone in Ashby Green wants to ruin us, and I won't stand for it." Her anger was a spark, a reminder of her strength, but I saw the fear beneath it. I tucked the letter into my pocket, determined to show it to Miss Jane Marple. Her quiet wisdom had already cut through the village's fog of suspicion, and I trusted her to see what I could not. But first, I needed to gauge the village's mood. Clara's death had stirred a hornet's nest, and I wondered if others had received new letters. I limped to the village green, where the morning was deceptively serene. The war memorial gleamed in the sunlight, its names a sombre roll call. A few women stood outside the grocer's, their voices low but urgent. I caught fragments. Another letter, to Mrs. Tate this time. Called her a meddler. Dreadful business. Mrs. Fowler, the grocer's wife, was at the centre, her apron askew, her face alight with the thrill of gossip. "It's that Ned, Carter," she declared. "He's got the devil in him, mark my words." I moved on, wary of her fervour. Ned was an easy scapegoat, his sullenness a canvas for the village's fears, but I doubted he had the cunning for this. At the church, I saw Mr. Tate polishing the brass lectern, his movements slow, his face drawn. "Another letter?" I asked gently, nodding to his wife's mention. He sighed, setting down his cloth. "Yes, to Agnes. It's upset her terribly. Accused her of interfering in people's lives, stirring trouble. She's only ever tried to help." His voice cracked, and I felt a pang of sympathy. The Tates were kind, if overly earnest, and the letters were eroding their spirit. I asked about the vicarage typewriter, hoping for a lead. "It's old," he said, "but I haven't used it in months. Agnes types the parish accounts on it. Sometimes, but it's in the study, locked away. Surely no one's been in there." His doubt was a mirror to my own. The typewriter clue was maddeningly elusive. My next stop was the tea room, now run by Sarah, Clara's assistant, who'd reopened it at the village's urging. The room felt hollow without Clara's warmth, its tables half empty. Sarah poured me tea, her hands unsteady. "It's not the same," she said. "People come, but they whisper about Clara, about the letters. I got one myself yesterday saying I'm lazy, stealing from the till. It's lies, Mr. Langley." I leaned forward, my interest piqued. "Typed like the others?" She nodded. "Same as Clara's, with that funny tea. I showed it to Miss Brent. She came in for tea, and she said to burn it, but I kept it. Want to see?" She fetched a crumpled sheet from her apron, and I studied it. The slanted T was there, the words vicious but vague, much like Edith's. "Miss Brent saw this?" I asked, surprised. Lydia Brent rarely mingled, her reclusive nature fueling suspicion. "Yes," Sarah said. "She was kind in her way. Said the writer's a coward, hiding behind a machine. But she looked worried, I thought. I thanked her and left. The letters wait in my mind." Lydia's involvement, however slight, was new. Was she merely curious, or did she know more? I decided to visit her cottage, a stone's throw from the village's edge, its garden a riot of untamed roses. I knocked, but no answer came. Through a gap in the curtains I saw a flicker of movement, as if someone had stepped back from the window. I left, uneasy, her silence louder than words. Miss Marple was my next destination. I found her at the vicarage, in a small parlour cluttered with chintz and china. She was writing a letter, her pen scratching softly, but she set it aside when I entered. "Mr. Langley," she said, her eyes bright, "you've that look again. Another letter, I presume." I showed her Edith's letter, and she studied it, her lips pursing. "This is bolder," she said. "The writer knows Miss Langley's routines, her visits to the vicar. It's not guesswork. They're observing, closely. And the typewriter, still with that slanted tee. Have you learned more about the machines in the village? I told her about the vicarage typewriter locked in the study and Sarah's letter, seen by Lydia Brent. The village hall machine matches, I added, but it's public. Dr. Morton's surgery might have one too. I haven't checked. Miss Marple nodded, her fingers tapping her knitting, which lay folded in her lap. A typewriter is a personal thing, Mr. Langley, but also a shared one in a village. The hall's machine is promising, but we must consider who has access and who has motive. This letter to your sister, it's meant to provoke, to isolate. The writer wants Ashby Green to turn on itself. Her words echoed my own fears. You still think Clara's death is part of this? I asked. Oh, yes, she said, her voice soft but certain. Clara's death is the knot at the centre of this tangle. The letters prepared the stage, made her despair plausible. But I wonder about her visitors that day. Miss Morton, for instance. She was close to Clara, wasn't she? I nodded, recalling Helen Morton's grief at the vicarage gathering. Sarah said Helen was there, returning a tray. They talked, but she didn't hear what about. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Miss Morton is an interesting figure. Charming, but guarded, like a house with locked rooms. And her brother, Dr. Morton, he has access to medicines, perhaps even the sleeping pills found with Clara. We mustn't jump to conclusions, but we must watch. Her suggestion sent a ripple of suspicion through me. Helen had seemed genuinely shaken by Clara's death, but grief could mask other things. And Dr. Morton, with his tired eyes and strained manner, could he be involved? I decided to observe. Helen myself. That afternoon I passed the surgery, where she was sweeping the porch, her movements brisk, but her face pale. I called out a greeting, and she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Terrible times, Mr. Langley, she said. These letters, they're tearing us apart. Have you had one? I asked, keeping my tone light. Her hand tightened on the broom. Not yet, thank goodness, but I hear about them everywhere. Poor Sarah, and now your sister. It's cruel. She turned away, and I sensed she was hiding something, though I couldn't say what. Later, I visited the Dog and Whistle, hoping to catch the village's pulse. The pub was crowded, the air thick with tobacco and ale. Mr. Gibbs, the landlord, leaned over the bar, his voice low. Another letter to old Mr. Harrow, the butcher. Called him a cheat, watering his meat. He's fit to be tied. I listened, as others chimed in, their theories wilder with each pint. Ned Carter remained a favourite suspect, his absence tonight noted with suspicion. But a new name surfaced, Mrs. Tate. She's always poking her nose in, said a farmer. Bet she's typing those letters to teach us a lesson. The idea was laughable. Mrs. Tate was meddlesome but harmless, but it showed how far trust had eroded. I returned to Rose Cottage, my mind a whirl of names and motives. Edith was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with a vigour that suggested she was battling the letters in her own way. "Any luck?" she asked, not looking up. I told her about the new letters, and Miss Marple's thoughts on Helen. "She thinks the letters are a screen," I said, "hiding something bigger, maybe tied to Clara." Edith set down her knife. "If that's true, Robert, we're not safe. None of us are. Whoever's doing this knows too much." I agreed, but I kept Miss Marple's calm in mind. She'd said to watch, to wait. So I did, though the waiting was hard. That night I sat by the window, the village dark beyond the glass. A figure moved in the lane, too quick to identify, and I wondered if the poison pen was out there, typing their next blow. The next morning I learned of another letter, this one to Mr. Gibbs, accusing him of watering his ale. The village was a tinderbox, and the letters were the spark. I thought of Miss Marple, her quiet certainty, and knew we needed her clarity now more than ever. Ashby Green was unravelling, and I feared the truth would come at a cost. Chapter 5. Murder Uncovered. The air in Ashby Green had grown heavy, as if the village itself were holding its breath, braced for a storm that had not yet broken. Clara Henshaw's death, a wound still raw, had cast a pall over the lanes and cottages, and the poison pen letters, with their cruel accusations, fanned the flames of distrust. Each new letter slipped under doors, tucked into mailboxes, tightened the noose of suspicion, and I, Robert Langley, felt its pressure keenly. Rose Cottage, where my sister Edith and I had sought refuge, was no longer a haven. Its walls seemed to echo the village's fears, and the slanted T of the typed letters haunted my thoughts like a cipher waiting to be cracked. The inquest into Clara's death was set for a Monday morning, and Ashby Green buzzed with a nervous energy, its residents drawn to the village hall like moths to a flame. The hall, usually a place of parish meetings and jumble sales, had been transformed into a makeshift courtroom, its wooden chairs arranged in rows, its windows open to let in the spring breeze. I arrived early, my limp more pronounced in the damp air, and found a seat near the front beside Edith, whose face was set in a mask of grim determination. She'd received no further letters since the last, but the sting of its words lingered, and she'd taken to avoiding the vicarage, wary of fueling gossip. The hall filled quickly, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and anxious sweat. Mrs. Fowler, the grocer's wife, sat 2 rows ahead, her head swivelling to catch every whisper. Mr. Tate, the vicar, was near the door, his spectacles glinting as he murmured to his wife Agnes, whose nervous hands clutched a prayer book. Dr. Morton, the village physician, stood at the back, his face pale and drawn, as if the weight of Clara's death pressed on him personally. His sister, Helen Morton, was absent, and I wondered why. Her friendship with Clara had been close, and her absence felt like a missing piece in a puzzle. "Miss is near." Jane Marple slipped in quietly, taking a seat beside me. Her straw hat was tilted slightly, her knitting bag at her feet, but her pale blue eyes were alert, scanning the room with a clarity that belied her frail appearance. "A sad day, Mr. Langley," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of voices, but perhaps a revealing one. Inquests have a way of stirring things up, don't they? I nodded, sensing the weight of her words. "I hope so," I said. "Clara's death doesn't sit right with me. The letter, the pills, it's too neat somehow." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. "Neatness can be a deception, Mr. Langley. In my experience, truth is often messier than it appears. We shall see what the coroner uncovers." The coroner, a brisk man from the nearby town of Market Hampton, entered with a rustle of papers, his pince-nez perched on a sharp nose. He called the room to order, and a hush fell, broken only by the creak of chairs and the occasional cough. The proceedings began with formalities. Clara's identity, her occupation as the tea-room's proprietress, the date of her death. I listened, my mind drifting to the last time I'd seen her. Her hands steady as she poured tea, her smile warm despite the letter she'd received. Dr. Morton was called first, his testimony delivered in a low, strained voice. "I was summoned to the tea-room at 8 o'clock that evening," he said, rubbing his hands together, a habit I'd noticed before. Sarah, the assistant, found her. Clara was in her parlour, slumped in a chair. An empty vial of sleeping. Pills was on the table and a typed letter beside it. I checked for a pulse, but she was gone. The coroner peered over his glasses. "The pills, Dr. Morton, were they yours?" Dr. Morton hesitated, his fingers twitching. "Not precisely. They were a common barbiturate available by prescription, but I hadn't prescribed them to Clara. She may have obtained them elsewhere." A murmur rippled through the room, and I glanced at Miss Marple, whose expression remained serene, though her knitting needles, now in her hands, moved a fraction faster. "Elsewhere," she whispered, almost to herself. "How convenient." Sarah, the tea-room assistant, testified next, her voice trembling as she recounted finding Clara. "I went back after closing to fetch my scarf," she said, twisting her hands. "The parlour door was ajar, and I saw her. I thought she was asleep at first, but then I saw the bottle, the letter. I ran for Dr. Morton." Her eyes filled with tears, and the coroner dismissed her gently. The letter itself was presented, sealed, in a clear envelope, its typed words visible through the plastic. The coroner read it aloud. "Clara Henshaw, your smiles hide a harlot's heart. How many husbands have you lured with your teas and cakes?" The words were met with gasps and misses. Fowler's hand flew to her mouth, though her eyes gleamed with fascination. I noted the slanted T, unmistakable even from a distance, and felt a surge of frustration. The typewriter clue was still too broad, pointing to the village hall, but no one in particular. Then came the bombshell. The coroner called a pathologist, a thin man with a precise manner, who'd examined Clara's body. The cause of death was indeed an overdose of barbiturates, he said, adjusting his notes. But there was an anomaly. The pills contained traces of a rare poison, cyanide to be exact, not present in standard prescriptions. It was administered in a dose sufficient to kill, likely mixed with the pills or her tea. The room erupted in whispers, and the coroner banged his gavel. "Order, please. Are you suggesting, Dr. Wells, that Mrs. Henshaw did not take her own life?" The pathologist nodded. "The presence of cyanide suggests foul play. Suicide by barbiturates is plausible, but cyanide is not. A common choice. It's more likely she was poisoned, and the pills were a cover." Murder. The word hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. Edith gripped my arm, her nails digging in. "Murdered," she whispered. "Clara." Miss Marple's needles stopped and she leaned closer. "This changes everything, Mr. Langley. A poison pen letter to mask a poisoning. How very deliberate. We must look at who had access to cyanide, and who knew Clara's habits well enough to administer it." The inquest concluded with a verdict of unlawful killing, pending further investigation. The constable, a young man named Harris, announced that the police would be interviewing villagers, and I saw fear flicker in more than one face. Dr. Morton's shoulders sagged, as if the verdict were a personal blow. Mr. Tate clutched his wife's hand, his lips moving in silent prayer. Mrs. Fowler was already whispering to her neighbour, her voice a buzz of speculation. As we left the hall, the village felt different, its beauty tainted by a new reality. Clara hadn't chosen death. Someone had chosen it for her. I walked with Miss Marple toward the vicarage, the gravel crunching under our feet. "Cyanide," I said, my mind racing. "That's not easy to come by, is it?" "Not at all," she replied, her tone thoughtful. "It's used in certain industries, photography perhaps, or pest control, but not readily available. A doctor might have access through medical suppliers, though it's tightly controlled. Or someone with a garden shed hoarding old chemicals. We must consider Clara's circle. Those who visited her shared her tea. I thought of Helen Morton, who'd been at the tea room the day Clara died, and Sarah's mention of their private talk. Helen Morton was close to her, I said. And Dr. Morton, those pills, the cyanide, could he have supplied them? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression was grave. Dr. Morton is a possibility, but we mustn't be hasty. He's a man under strain, and his sister, Miss Morton, is more complex than she appears. Then there's young Ned Carter, who was seen near the tea-room, and Miss Brent, who saw Sarah's letter. Each has a thread in this web, but we need the pattern. Her metaphor lingered as I returned to Rose Cottage. Edith was in the kitchen, her hands busy with dough, but her face was drawn. "Murder," she said, as if testing the word. I knew Clara wasn't the sort to give up. But who would do this, Robert, and why? I had no answer, but I shared Miss Marple's thoughts on cyanide and Clara's visitors. Edith frowned. Helen Morton was always at the tea-room chatting with Clara. And Ned Carter, he's trouble but murder? That's a leap. I agreed, but the inquest had shifted my perspective. The letters, once a malicious nuisance, now seemed part of AOA. Larger design, their accusations a smokescreen for a killer's intent. I resolved to visit the tea-room again, to speak with Sarah, and to watch Helen Morton closely. The next day, I found Sarah sweeping the tea-room's porch, her movements listless. "It's not right," she said, leaning on her broom. "Mrs. Henshaw was good to everyone. Who'd want her dead?" I asked about Clara's last day, probing for details Sarah might have overlooked. "She was tired," Sarah said. "Kept checking the clock, like she was waiting for someone. Miss Morton came by, as I told you, and they talked in the parlour. I heard Clara say something about promises, but I didn't catch the rest." "Promises?" I repeated, my interest piqued. "Did Clara seem upset?" Sarah nodded. "A bit. Not angry, but worried maybe. I thought it was the letter, but now, with the poison—" She shivered, and I let her be, her words a new thread in the tangle. I passed Helen Morton in the lane, carrying a basket of laundry, her face composed but her eyes red-rimmed. "Mr. Langley," she said, pausing, "this business with Clara, it's awful. Murder, they say. I can't believe it." "You were close to her," I said, watching her reaction. "Did she ever mention enemies, or someone she feared?" Helen's grip on the basket tightened. "No, never. Clara was loved, you know that. The letters upset her, but she was strong, I thought." She stopped, her voice catching. "I thought she'd weather it." Her grief seemed genuine, but I remembered. Miss Marple's words about locked rooms. I thanked her and moved on, my suspicions unresolved. At the Dog and Whistle that evening, the mood was grim, the usual banter replaced by hushed theories. Ned Carter was there, nursing a pint, his eyes darting as if he felt the village's gaze. "They're saying I did it," he muttered when I approached. "I didn't even like Clara, but I wouldn't kill her." I believed him, or wanted to. His anger was too blunt, too unrefined for the calculated act of poisoning. But someone in Ashby Green had that calculation, and the letters were their shield. I visited Miss Marple again, finding her in the vicarage garden, tying up rose bushes with twine. I told her about Sarah's mention of promises and Helen's guarded demeanour. She listened, her hands steady, then said, "Promises are powerful things, Mr. Langley. They bind people, and sometimes break them. Clara may have held a promise that someone wanted silenced, and the cyanide, it points to someone with knowledge, perhaps even access to Dr. Morton's supplies. You think Helen?" I asked, my voice low. "I think we must consider her," she said, "but also others. The letters are a distraction, but they're also a clue. Their writer knows Ashby Green's secrets, and Clara's death is one of them. We must be patient and very, very watchful." Her words stayed with me as I walked home. The village bathed in twilight, its cottages glowing like lanterns. A new letter arrived that night, slipped under our door, this time for me. "Robert Langley, your questions won't save you. Stop prying, or you'll join Clara." The slanted T was there, a mocking signature. I showed it to Edith, who paled but said, "We can't stop now, Robert, not if it's murder." I agreed, but fear gnawed at me. Ashby Green was a battlefield, its weapons words and poison, and Miss Marple was our guide through the fray. I trusted her to find the truth, but I wondered what price we'd pay before she did. Chapter 6. Miss Marple's Plan. The revelation that Clara Henshaw's death was murder had transformed Ashby Green from a quaint haven into a labyrinth of suspicion, its lanes and cottages shadowed by unspoken fears. The poison pen letters, with their slanted T and vicious accusations, were no longer mere malice. They were threads in a darker tapestry, woven to conceal a killer's hand. I, Robert Langley, felt the village's pulse quicken with each new letter, my journalist's instinct battling the dread that crept into Rose Cottage, where my sister Edith and I now lived as wary tenants of a fractured community. The inquest's verdict had ignited a firestorm of whispers, and the latest letter, to me, warning me to stop prying or join Clara, had left Edith shaken, her usual resolve fraying at the edges. Yet it was Miss Jane Marple's quiet certainty that anchored me. Her observations, delivered with the gentle precision of her knitting needles, had already shifted my view of Clara's death, and I sensed she was poised to act. The village was a tinderbox, and Miss Marple, I suspected, was ready to strike a match. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the sky a pale wash of blue, when I found her in the vicarage parlour, a room of faded velvet and ticking clocks. She was sipping tea, her knitting bag at her side, but her eyes were bright with purpose. "Mr. Langley," she said, setting down her cup, "you've come at the right moment. I've been thinking about our poison pen, and I believe it's time to draw them out." I took a seat, my leg aching from the walk. "Draw them out? You mean a trap?" "Precisely," she said, her voice soft but firm. The writer is bold but cautious. They rely on secrecy, on the fear their letters. So, if we can make them feel exposed, they may act rashly, revealing themselves. But it must be done carefully, like coaxing a bird from a thicket. I leaned forward, intrigued. What's your plan? Miss Marple's lips curved in a small smile. I propose we spread a rumour. Nothing too alarming, but enough to unsettle our writer. Let it be known that I've received a letter, one that hints at the poison pen's identity. I'll say I'm consulting the police, but I'll be vague, to keep them guessing. We'll announce this at the church social tomorrow evening, where most of the village will be. If the writer is among us, they'll feel the net closing. I felt a thrill, tempered by caution. It's risky, I said. That letter to me, it threatened harm. If they think you're onto them, they might target you. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Oh, I'm an old woman, Mr. Langley, and old women are often underestimated. But I'll take precautions. I'd like you to keep watch at the social, note who reacts, who leaves early, and perhaps ask your sister to help spread the rumour. She's well liked, and her word will carry weight. I agreed, though unease gnawed at me. The plan was clever, but Ashby Green was a powder keg, and I feared the spark might ignite more than we intended. I left the vicarage and stopped by the village green, where the air was sweet with cut grass. Mrs. Fowler was outside her shop, gossiping with a customer about the inquest. "Cyanide, can you believe it?" she said, her voice carrying. "Someone in this village is a monster." I nodded politely but moved on, wary of her eagerness to fan the flames. At the tea-room, now a subdued shadow of its former self, I spoke with Sarah, who was polishing tables with a distracted air. "Everyone's talking about murder," she said, her voice low. "I keep thinking about that day, Miss Morton's visit, Clara's worry. I wish I'd listened more." I probed gently. "You mentioned Clara talking about promises. Anything else come to mind?" Sarah frowned, wiping her hands on her apron. "Not much, but Clara seemed distracted, like she was expecting someone later. I saw Ned Carter outside, loitering, by the gate, but he didn't come in. I told the constable, but he didn't seem to care." Her words added to my suspicions. Ned's presence, Helen's private talk. Each was a piece, but the puzzle was incomplete. I thanked Sarah and headed to the church, hoping to find Mr. Tate. He was in the vestry, sorting hymnals, his face etched with worry. "Another letter," he confided, unprompted, "to Agnes, accusing her of spreading lies about Clara. It's breaking her heart." I sympathized, then asked about the vicarage typewriter, still a potential lead. "It's locked in the study," he said, "but I checked it yesterday, after the inquest. The T is straight, not slanted. It's not the one." His certainty was a blow. The village hall typewriter remained our only confirmed match, but its public access made it a frustrating clue. That evening, I shared Miss Marple's plan with Edith, who was in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour. "A trap," she said, her eyes narrowing. "It's bold, I'll give her that. But I don't like you playing watchdog, Robert. That letter to you was a warning." "I'll be careful," I said, though her concern warmed me. "Will you help spread the rumour?" She sighed, brushing flour from her apron. "I suppose I must. The sooner this ends, the better. I'll talk to Mrs. Fowler tomorrow. She'll have it all over the village by noon. True to her word, Edith visited the grocer's the next morning, casually mentioning that Miss Marple had received a letter hinting at the poison pen's identity and was considering police action. By midday, the rumour was a wildfire, its smoke curling through the lanes. At the post office, I overheard a woman whisper, "Miss Marple's got proof, they say. Someone's in for it now." I felt a mix of satisfaction and dread. The trap was set, but what would it catch? The church social was held in the village hall, its rafters festooned with paper garlands, its tables laden with scones and lemonade. The mood was forced, the villagers' smiles thin, as if they sensed the undercurrent of fear. I arrived early, positioning myself near the door to watch the arrivals. Edith was already there, chatting with Mrs. Tate, her voice light but her eyes sharp. Miss Marple entered quietly, her hat slightly askew, her knitting bag a constant companion. She nodded to me, a signal to stay alert. The hall filled with familiar faces. Mrs. Fowler, her gossip now tinged with nervousness. Mr. Gibbs, the pub landlord, his scarred hand gripping a glass. Dr. Morton, looking more haggard than ever. His Sister Helen at his side, her charm subdued. Ned Carter slouched in a corner, his cap pulled low, while Miss Lydia Brent, the reclusive seamstress, stood apart, her fingers tracing the edge of a tablecloth. Each was a suspect, their motives opaque, their secrets a potential key. Miss Marple took the floor during a lull, her voice clear despite her frail frame. "Good evening, friends," she said, her tone warm but deliberate. "I've been touched by your welcome to Ashby Green, but I must speak of a troubling matter. I've received a letter, not like the others, but one that suggests the identity of our poison pen. I intend to share this with the authorities, but I urge the writer to come forward. Confession is better than discovery." Her words landed like a stone in a pond, ripples spreading through the crowd. Mrs. Fowler gasped, her hand at her throat. Dr. Morton's face tightened, his eyes darting to Helen, who stared at the floor. Ned Carter shifted, his fists clenching, while Lydia Brent's gaze was steady, almost defiant. I watched them all, my heart pounding, searching for a telltale sign. The social continued, but the air was charged. Helen Morton excused herself halfway through, claiming a headache, her departure swift but noticed. Ned lingered, his eyes on Miss Marple, while Lydia slipped out quietly, her shawl drawn tight. I made a mental note of each, my suspicions swirling. Dr. Morton stayed, but his conversation was distracted, his hands restless. As the evening wound down, I joined Miss Marple near the refreshment table. "Any reactions?" she asked, her voice low. "Helen left early," I said. "Ned looked angry. Lydia was hard to read. Dr. Morton seemed nervous, but that's his usual state." She nodded, her needles clicking softly. "Good observations, Mr. Langley. The writer is rattled, I think. They'll act soon, perhaps tonight. I'd like you to keep an eye on the vicarage, from a distance. I'll stay there, but I won't be alone. Margaret's husband is a sturdy man." I agreed, though the thought of lurking in the dark unsettled me. That night, I took a position behind a yew tree, across from the vicarage, the air cool and damp. The village was silent, its lights winking out one by one. Around midnight, a figure approached the vicarage gate, moving with stealth. I strained to see, but the shadows hid their face. They paused, then slipped something under the door, a letter I was sure, and vanished into the lane. I waited, my breath shallow, then crept to the vicarage. The envelope was there, cheap and typed, addressed to Miss Marple. I didn't open it, but I knew it was a response to her gambit. I returned to my post, watching until dawn, but no one else came. The next morning, I brought the letter to Miss Marple, who was in the vicarage garden, tending a lavender bush. She opened it, her face impassive, and read aloud. "Jane Marple, your meddling will cost you. Leave Ashby Green, or you'll regret it." The slanted T was there, a mocking echo of the others. "A threat," she said, folding the letter. "Ah, writer is frightened, Mr. Langley. This is progress. But we must be cautious. Their fear makes them dangerous." I felt a chill, not just from the letter, but from her calm. "What now?" I asked. "We watch," she said. "The social stirred the pot, and this letter is the steam. Helen Morton's early departure is curious, as is Ned's anger. Lydia, Brent's silence intrigues me, and Dr. Morton's nerves bear watching. We're close, Mr. Langley, but we need one more push." I left, my mind a whirl of possibilities. The village was a chessboard, and Miss Marple was moving her pieces with precision. But the threat to her life was real, and I feared the game was far from over. That afternoon, I passed Helen Morton in the lane, her face pale, her basket empty. She avoided my gaze, and I wondered what secret she carried. Ned Carter was at the pub, his mood darker than ever, while Lydia Brent's cottage remained shuttered, a fortress of solitude. At Rose Cottage, Edith was waiting, her face anxious. "Another letter," she said, seeing my expression. I told her about the trap, the social, and the threat to Miss Marple. "She's not backing down," I said. "But I'm worried, Edith. This is getting dangerous." She nodded, her hands clasped. "Then we help her, Robert. We owe Clara that much. But be careful. You're in their sights too." Her words echoed as I sat by the window that night, the village dark and still. The poison pen was cornered, their letters a desperate defence. Miss Marple's plan had worked, but at what cost? I thought of Clara, her life stolen, and knew we had to see this through, whatever the risk. Chapter 7. Piecing the Puzzle. The trap set at the church social had stirred Ashby Green's undercurrents, and the threatening letter slipped under Miss Marple's door was proof that the poison pen writer was rattled. Yet the village remained a cipher, its charming facade masking a murderer's intent. Clara Henshaw's death, now confirmed as murder by cyanide, hung over us like a storm cloud, and the letters, with their slanted T and venomous words, were both shield and weapon for the killer. I, Robert Langley, felt the weight of each clue, my journalist's mind grappling with fragments that refused to form a whole. Rose Cottage, where my sister Edith and I resided, was a fragile outpost in a village-turned-battlefield, and I relied on Miss Marple's clarity to guide us through the fog. The morning after the social was grey, the sky a low ceiling of clouds that mirrored Ashby Green's mood. I woke to the sound of rain pattering on the cottage's thatched roof, my leg aching from the damp. Edith was in the kitchen, her hands busy with a kettle, but her silence spoke of worry. The letter threatening Miss Marple had shaken her, though she'd insisted we press on. "Clara deserves justice," she'd said last night, her voice firm, despite the fear in her eyes. I agreed, But the killer's boldness, delivering a letter under cover of darkness, made me uneasy. They were watching, and we were in their sights. I resolved to meet Miss Marple, hoping her insight could knit our scattered clues into a pattern. But first I needed to explore the village, to test the threads we'd uncovered. The village hall typewriter, Helen Morton's guarded demeanour, Ned Carter's loitering, and Lydia Brent's enigmatic silence. Each was a piece, but the puzzle's shape eluded me. I limped to the village green, the rain a soft curtain that blurred the cottage's outlines. The grocer's shop was quiet, Mrs. Fowler's usual chatter subdued as she stacked tins. "Everyone's talking about Miss Marple's letter," she said, catching my eye. "Says it names the poison pen. Is it true?" Her curiosity was tinged with unease, and I sensed she feared being next. "I wouldn't know," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "But it's got people rattled, hasn't it?" She nodded, her hands pausing. "Rattled's the word. Mr. Gibbs got another letter yesterday, accusing him of cheating at cards. He's furious, says he'll find the writer himself." I made a mental note. Another letter, another distraction. The killer was keeping the village off balance, but why? At the church, I found Mr. Tate polishing pews, his movements methodical, but his face weary. This business with Clara, and now these. "Threats to Miss Marple," he said, shaking his head. "It's as if the devil's loose in Ashby Green." I asked about the social, probing for reactions he'd noticed. "Miss Morton left early," he said. "Looked pale, like she'd seen a ghost. And Ned Carter, he was glaring at everyone. But that's his way." His words confirmed my observations, but offered no new clarity. I moved on to the tea room, where Sarah was serving a lone customer, her smile forced. "It's been quiet since the inquest," she said, pouring me tea. "People don't linger anymore. They're scared." I asked about Helen Morton's visits, hoping to unearth more about her talk of promises with Clara. Sarah frowned, wiping a cup. She came by often, always friendly, but that last day they were quieter, like they didn't want me hearing. Clara mentioned something about debts, not promises. I got that wrong before. I think it was money. "Debts," I repeated, my pulse quickening. "Did Clara lend money?" Sarah shrugged. "Maybe. She was kind, helped people out, but I didn't ask and she didn't say more." Her words were a spark, illuminating a motive I hadn't considered. If Clara had lent money to Helen, or someone else, and demanded repayment, could that have led to murder? I thanked Sarah and headed for Miss Marple, my mind buzzing. The vicarage was a haven of warmth, its parlour smelling of lavender and beeswax. Miss Marple was by the window, reading a letter. Not a poison pen one, but a note from her niece, Margaret. She set it aside, her eyes sharp. "Mr. Langley," she said, "you've been busy, I see. What have you learned?" I told her about Sarah's correction. Debts, not promises, and the new letter to Mr. Gibbs. I also shared Mr. Tate's observations about Helen and Ned at the social. She listened, her fingers resting on her knitting, which lay folded like a map of her thoughts. "Debts," she mused. "That's significant. Money can twist people, Mr. Langley, make them desperate. Clara was generous, but generosity can breed resentment if repayment is pressed. We must learn more about her finances." Nodded, then showed her the threatening letter from the vicarage door, which I'd kept safe. She examined it, her lips pursing. "This is personal," she said. The writer fears exposure, and they're targeting me because I've stirred the waters. But it's the same typewriter with that slanted T. The village hall machine is still our best lead, though its accessibility complicates things." "What about other typewriters?" I asked. "Dr. Morton's surgery, perhaps?" "Indeed," she said. "A doctor's office often has one for records, and cyanide, as we learned, could be sourced through medical channels, though it's rare. Dr. Morton's strain intrigues me. He's a man carrying a burden. His sister Helen is closer to the heart of this, I think. Her friendship with Clara, her early departure from the social, these are not coincidences." I felt a chill. "You think Helen's the killer?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle but guarded. "I think she's a piece of the puzzle, but we need more to see the whole. Ned Carter's presence near the tea room is curious, but his anger lacks the subtlety of these letters. Lydia Brent, too, is an enigma. Her silence could be innocence or calculation. We must test our suspects discreetly." Her words were a call to action, and I resolved to investigate further. That afternoon, I visited Dr. Morton's surgery, a narrow house with a faint smell of antiseptic. He was with a patient, but Helen answered the door, her smile polite but strained. "Mr. Langley," she said, "this isn't a good time. My brother's busy." "Just a quick question," I said, keeping my tone light. "Does the surgery have a typewriter? For records, perhaps?" Her eyes flickered, but she answered smoothly. "Yes, an old one in the back office. Why do you ask?" "Curiosity," I said, shrugging. "With all these letters, I'm wondering about typewriters in the village." Her smile faltered, and I sensed I'd touched a nerve. I thanked her and left, determined to return when I could examine the machine. Next, I sought out Ned Carter, finding him at the edge of the village mending a fence. His cap was low, his hands rough with work. "What now?" he said, his voice gruff. "Come to accuse me like the rest?" "No accusations," I said. "But you were at the tea room the day Clara died. Did you see anything odd?" He snorted, hammering a nail. "I saw nothing. Asked for work, got turned away. Clara was busy, that's all." His defensiveness was a wall, but I sensed no guile. Ned was a misfit, not a murderer, or so I hoped. Lydia Brent's cottage was my final stop, its overgrown garden a barrier to the world. I knocked, and after a long pause, she opened the door, her tall frame filling the doorway. "Mr. Langley," she said, her voice sharp, "what brings you here?" "I'm trying to understand these letters," I said. "You saw Sarah's. Any thoughts on who's writing them?" Her eyes narrowed. "A coward, that's who. Someone with too much time and not enough spine. I've no typewriter, if that's what you're thinking." She closed the door before I could respond, her abruptness a challenge. I left, unconvinced of her innocence, but lacking proof. Back at Rose Cottage, I found Edith in the parlour, a letter in her hand, not a poison pen, one, but a note from a friend. "Any progress?" she asked, her tone weary. I shared my findings, Helen's reaction, Ned's denial, Lydia's deflection. "Miss Marple thinks Helen's key," I said, "and the debt angle, Clara lending money, could be the motive." Nitochez frowned. "Money's a nasty business. If Clara was pressing someone, they might have panicked. But murder? That's cold." I agreed, but Miss Marple's words echoed. We needed the pattern. That evening, I returned to the vicarage, where Miss Marple was arranging flowers, her hands deft despite her age. I told her about my visits, and she listened, her eyes distant, but focused. Helen Morton is our pivot, she said. Her access to Clara, her brother's supplies, her unease at the social, these align too neatly. But we need evidence, not suspicion. The typewriter in the surgery is promising. Could you find a way to test it? I hesitated, the risk daunting. I'd need to get inside without raising suspicion. Dr. Morton's always there. Perhaps during the village fete, she suggested. It's tomorrow, and the Mortons will be out. Edith could distract them. She's good at conversation. Her plan was bold, and I felt a surge of admiration for her nerve. The fete was a whirl of colour and noise, its stalls crowded with cakes and crafts. I slipped away, leaving Edith to engage Helen and Dr. Morton in talk of preserves. The surgery was unlocked, a common village trust, and I found the back office, where an old typewriter sat on a cluttered desk. I typed a quick line. The fox runs fast, and checked the result. The T slanted left, a perfect match. My heart raced. This was the machine, or one of them. I hid the paper and left, rejoining the fete as if nothing had happened. Helen was laughing with Edith, but her eyes darted to me, and I wondered if she sensed my intrusion. Dr. Morton was at a stall, his face grey, as if the village's scrutiny were a physical weight. That night, I showed Miss Marple the typed sample. "The surgery's typewriter," I said. "It matches." Her eyes gleamed. "Well done, Mr. Langley. This narrows our field. Helen has access, and her brother's supplies could include cyanide. But we need her motive. Why kill Clara? The debt is a clue, but we need proof. Could Clara have kept records of her loans? Hadn't considered that. She might have, in the tea room. I'll ask Sarah." Miss Marple nodded. "Do so discreetly. And watch Helen. She's feeling the pressure. The letters, the trap. Now this. She'll act soon, and we must be ready." Left, the rain now a steady drum on my umbrella. Ashby Green was a maze, but Miss Marple was charting its paths. The typewriter was a breakthrough, but the debt motive was still a shadow. I thought of Helen, her polished charm, Ned, his blunt defiance, Lydia, her closed door. One held the key, and I trusted Miss Marple to find it. At Rose Cottage, Edith was waiting, her face anxious. "You're playing a dangerous game," she said, hearing of the typewriter. "If Helen's the killer, she won't stop at letters." "I know," I said, but Clara's memory spurred me on. The puzzle was taking shape, and Miss Marple's hand was steady. I slept fitfully, dreaming of a typewriter clattering in the dark, its keys spelling out a truth we were only beginning to grasp. Chapter 8. The Truth Emerges. The discovery of the matching typewriter in Dr. Morton's surgery had tightened the noose around the mystery of Clara Henshaw's murder. Yet Ashby Green remained a village on edge, its serenity fractured by the poison pen letters that continued to sow discord, the slanted T on the typed threats, the cyanide that ended Clara's life, and the whispered debts that Sarah had revealed, all pointed to a killer hiding in plain sight. I, Robert Langley, felt the weight of each clue, my journalists, resolve tested by the fear that gripped Rose Cottage, where my sister Edith and I now lived as wary participants in a deadly game. Miss Jane Marple's steady hand guided us, her trap at the church social, and her probing questions peeling back the layers of Ashby Green's secrets. But the truth, I sensed, was close, and its unveiling would be as painful as it was necessary. The morning after my clandestine visit to the surgery, the village woke to a drizzle that turned the lanes to mud and cast a sombre hue over the cottages. Edith was in the parlour, mending a scarf, her movements precise, but her face drawn. The threatening letter to Miss Marple, slipped under the vicarage door, had left her restless, and my discovery of the typewriter's match only deepened her unease. "You're sure it's the same machine?" she asked, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "Certain," I said, showing her the sample I'd typed. "The fox runs fast with its telltale slanted T. It's in Dr. Morton's office, accessible to him and Helen. And Sarah's talk of debts, Clara lending money, makes Helen a strong suspect. Miss Marple thinks it's about motive, something Clara knew that threatened Helen." Edith's lips thinned. "If it's Helen, she's fooled us all. That charm, those tears at the inquest. It's hard to believe she's a killer. But money can twist people, can't it?" I nodded, recalling Miss Marple's words about desperation. The village fete had been a turning point, exposing the typewriter. But we needed proof of Helen's motive. I resolved to visit Sarah again, to ask about Clara's financial records, and to consult Miss Marple on our next move. The rain kept most villagers indoors, and I pulled on a mackintosh, my limp more pronounced in the damp. The tea-room was nearly empty, its windows fogged with steam. Sarah was behind the counter, her apron spotted with flour, her eyes tired but alert. "Mr. Langley," she said, managing a smile, "you're out in this weather. Want tea?" I accepted a cup, then steered the conversation to Clara. "You mentioned debts," I said. "Did Clara keep records of money she lent? A ledger, maybe?" Sarah frowned, wiping her hands. "She did, actually. There's a little book in the parlour, under the desk. She'd jot down who owed what, small sums mostly, for neighbours in need. I haven't touched it since, well, you know." Her voice faltered, and I sensed her grief was still raw. "Can I see it?" I asked, keeping my tone gentle. "It might help the police." She hesitated, then nodded. "Wait here." She returned with a slim, leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed but neat. Clara's handwriting was precise, listing names and amounts. Mrs. Tate, $5, repaid. Mr. Gibbs, $10, outstanding. Helen Morton, $50, unpaid. My heart skipped. £50 was no small sum, enough to strain Helen's resources, especially with Dr. Morton's struggling practice. "Helen owed this much?" I said, pointing to the entry. Sarah nodded. "Clara mentioned it once, said Helen promised to pay but kept delaying. I think they argued about it that last day. Clara wasn't harsh, but she needed the money. Suppliers were pressing her." Thanked Sarah, tucking the notebook into my coat. This was the motive Miss Marple sought. A debt that Helen couldn't repay. A secret Clara might expose. I headed for the vicarage, the rain soaking my hat, my mind racing. Helen's charm, her early exit from the social, her access to the typewriter and possibly cyanide through her brother's supplies. It was falling into place. But we needed her to confess. Miss Marple was in the vicarage conservatory, a glass-walled room filled with ferns and the scent of damp earth. She was pruning a geranium, her shears snipping with quiet precision, but her eyes lit up when she saw me. "Mr. Langley," she said, setting down her tools, "you've found something, haven't you?" I showed her the ledger, pointing to Helen's debt. £50, I said. Sarah says Clara was pressing her for it. If Helen couldn't pay, and Clara threatened to tell Dr. Morton, it could have pushed her to act. Miss Marple's fingers traced the entry, her expression thoughtful. "This is significant," she said. "Money is a powerful motive, especially in a village where reputation is everything. Helen Morton is a proud woman, and her brother's practice is fragile. Exposure would ruin them. But we need more than a ledger. We need her to admit it." I nodded, then told her about my visit to the surgery, the typewriter's match, and Helen's guarded reaction. "She knows I'm asking questions," I said. "That letter to you, it's a warning, but also a sign she's scared." "Scared people make mistakes," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but steely. "I propose we invite Helen here, a pretext, perhaps to discuss the tea-room's future as a friend of Clara's. I'll speak with her gently and see what she reveals. You'll listen from the next room in case she says something incriminating. But we must be subtle, Mr. Langley. A cornered creature is dangerous." Her plan was bold, and I felt a mix of admiration and apprehension. "What if she denies everything?" I asked. "Then we press harder," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "But I've found that truth has a way of slipping out, especially when one feels safe. Helen trusts my harmless appearance. Many do, to their regret. I agreed, though. The risk weighed on me." We sent a note to Helen, asking her to tea the next afternoon to discuss a memorial fund for Clara. Edith, when I told her, was sceptical. "You're sure it's Helen?" she said, stirring a pot of soup. "What about Ned Carter or Lydia Brent? They've been in the shadows too." "Miss Marple's focused on Helen," I said. "The typewriter, the debt, her visits to Clara. It fits. Ned's too impulsive, Lydia too detached. But we'll know soon." Edith's eyes softened. "Be careful, Robert. If she's killed once, she won't hesitate again." The next day was clear, the rain giving way to a tentative sun that gilded the village. I spent the morning observing suspects, hoping for a final clue. Ned Carter was at the smithy, hammering horseshoes, his face set in a scowl. I asked about his whereabouts the night of the social, when the letter was delivered to Miss Marple. "I was at the pub," he said, not looking up. "Ask Gibbs. I didn't go near the vicarage." His alibi was plausible, and I let it be, his bluntness a contrast to Helen's polish. Lydia Brent was harder to pin down. Her cottage was shuttered, but I saw smoke from the chimney, a sign she was home. I knocked, but she didn't answer, and I left, her silence a puzzle I couldn't solve. At the pub, Mr. Gibbs confirmed Ned's story, adding, "He's a hothead, but not a killer. Whoever's doing this is sly, like a fox." By afternoon, I was at the vicarage, hidden in a small study adjacent to the conservatory, its door ajar. Miss Marple had arranged the tea table with care, a plate of scones and a pot of Darjeeling, lending an air of normalcy. Helen arrived promptly, her dress immaculate, but her face pale, her hands clutching a handbag. I peered through the crack, my breath shallow, as Miss Marple greeted her with a smile. "Miss Morton," she said, pouring tea, "it's kind of you to come." I thought, as Clara's friend, you'd have ideas for a memorial fund. The tea-room meant so much to Ashby Green." Helen nodded, her smile tight. Clara would have liked that. She loved the village, despite everything. Her voice wavered, and I sensed her guard was up. They spoke of Clara's kindness, the tea-room's legacy, but Miss Marple's tone shifted subtly, like a breeze turning cold. "It's such a tragedy," she said, "and now, with the inquest's verdict, murder, not suicide. It makes one wonder about those letters, doesn't it? So cruel and so cleverly timed." Helen's cup clinked against its saucer. "The letters are awful," she said. "I don't know who could do such a thing." Miss Marple's eyes were gentle but piercing. "Oh, I think you might, Miss Morton. Clara was your friend, after all. She shared her worries with you, didn't she? About money, perhaps? Or debts unpaid?" Helen stiffened, her fingers tightening on her bag. "I don't know what you mean. Clara never spoke of debts." "No?" Miss Marple said, her voice soft as silk. "That's odd, because her ledger tells a different story. £50, owed by you, and Clara pressing for repayment. It must have been difficult, with your brother's practice struggling. Exposure would have been ruinous." The air in the conservatory seemed to thicken, and I held my breath, my heart pounding. Helen's face drained of colour, her eyes darting to the door. "That's nonsense," she said, her voice rising. "Clara and I were friends. I'd never harm her." Miss Marple leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "But you did, didn't you? You went to the tea-room that day, talked of debts, and when Clara threatened to tell your brother, you acted. The cyanide, in her tea, perhaps, or the pills you left, to make it look like suicide, and the letters typed on your brother's machine, to sow confusion. It was clever, Helen, but not clever enough." Helen stood, her chair scraping the floor. "This is outrageous! You've no proof, you meddling old woman!" Her voice was a hiss, but her hands shook, betraying her. Miss Marple remained calm, her knitting now in her lap. The typewriter, in the surgery with its slanted T, matches the letters. The ledger shows your debt, and Sarah heard you argue with Clara about money you couldn't repay. You feared ruin, didn't you? Not just for yourself, but for your brother, who depends on you." Helen's eyes filled with tears, and she sank back into her chair, her defences crumbling. "You don't understand," she whispered. "Clara was going to tell Edward. He'd have been humiliated, his practice finished. I begged her to wait, but she wouldn't listen. I didn't mean to kill her. I just wanted her quiet." I gripped the door frame, stunned by her admission. "Miss," Marple's voice was gentle but relentless. "So you poisoned her, Helen. Cyanide from your brother's supplies, and a letter to make it look like despair. The other letters were a smokescreen, weren't they? To hide your crime in a storm of suspicion." Helen sobbed, her hands covering her face. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "I typed them, all of them, on Edward's machine. I thought if everyone was accused, no one would look at me. Clara was my friend, but she was going to ruin us. I had no choice." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sombre. "You had a choice, Helen, and you chose murder. But it's over now. The police will need to know." I stepped into the room, unable to stay hidden. Helen's eyes widened, but she was too broken to protest. "I'll fetch Constable Harris," I said, my voice steady despite my shock. Miss Marple placed a hand on Helen's arm, a gesture of pity, not triumph. "You'll feel better for telling the truth," she said. "Secrets are a heavy burden." I left for the constable, the village blurring past me, Helen's confession a weight in my chest. At the police station, Harris listened, his young face hardening, and promised to come at once. As I returned to the vicarage, I saw Ned Carter in the lane, his cap askew, his eyes curious but innocent. Lydia Brent's cottage was lit, her shadow moving behind the curtains, a silent witness to the village's unravelling. They were free of suspicion, but Helen's guilt cast a long shadow. At the vicarage, Harris took Helen away, her head bowed, her handbag forgotten on the table. Miss Marple stood by the window, her knitting untouched, her face etched with sadness. "It's a tragic thing, Mr. Langley," she said. "Human nature can be so frail, driven by fear and pride. Helen loved her brother, but love can twist into something dark." I nodded, my throat tight. The letters, the cyanide, it was so calculated. "How did you know it was her?" "Little things," she said, her voice soft. Her grief was too polished, her departure from the social too convenient. The ledger, the typewriter, Sarah's words, they pointed to a woman desperate to protect her world. But it was her fear, Mr. Langley, that betrayed her. Fear makes us careless. We sat in silence, the conservatory's warmth a contrast to the cold truth. Ashby Green would heal, but Clara's absence would linger, a reminder of the cost of secrets. I thought of Edith, waiting at home, and knew she'd be relieved, but also saddened. The village was safe, but its innocence was lost. As I walked back to Rose Cottage, the sun broke through, casting long shadows across the green. The war memorial stood sentinel, its name's a testament to loss. I passed Dr. Morton's surgery, its windows dark, and wondered how he'd bear his sister's betrayal. The poison pen was silenced, but its echoes would haunt Ashby Green for years to come. Chapter 9. Justice Served. The arrest of Helen Morton had pierced the veil of Ashby Green's tranquillity, exposing the raw wound of Clara Henshaw's murder and the poison pen letters that had masked it. The village, once a tapestry of charming cottages and neighbourly smiles, now bore the scars of betrayal, its lanes heavy with the weight of truth. I, Robert Langley, felt the shift acutely, my journalist's curiosity sated, but my heart unsettled. Rose Cottage, where my sister Edith and I had sought refuge, was a quiet anchor amidst the storm, yet even its walls seemed to whisper of the secrets unravelled. Miss Jane Marple, with her gentle wisdom and unyielding perception, had guided us to the killer. But the cost of justice lingered, a bittersweet note in the village's song. The morning after Helen's confession dawned crisp, the sky a clear blue that belied the turmoil below. I woke to the scent of Edith's baking, her way of reclaiming normalcy, but her eyes were shadowed as she set a plate of scones before me. "It's over then," she said, her voice a mix of relief and sorrow. Helen Morton, of all people, I'd never have guessed. "Nor I admitted, spreading jam on a scone. She played her part well, grieving friend, devoted sister, but that debt to Clara, the fear of ruin, it broke her." The ledger's entry, the slanted T of the surgery's typewriter, Sarah's overheard argument, all had pointed to Helen. Yet her confession in the vicarage conservatory had stunned me, a raw unravelling of a woman undone by desperation. Edith poured tea, her hands steady but her brow furrowed. What happens now? The village is in pieces, Robert. People trusted Helen, and Dr. Morton. How will he go on? I had no answer, but I knew Miss Marple would have thoughts. Helen's arrest had been swift, Constable Harris escorting her to the station in Market Hampton, where she'd face charges for murder and the malicious letters. The news had spread like wildfire, carried by Mrs. Fowler's eager tongue and the hushed exchanges at the Dog and Whistle. I resolved to visit the vicarage, to hear Miss Marple's reflections and gauge the village's pulse. The green was subdued as I limped through it, the war memorial a silent sentinel under the morning sun. A few children played near the church, their laughter tentative, as if they sensed the adults' unease. At the grocer's, Mrs. Fowler was in her element, her voice carrying through the open door. Helen Morton, a murderer. I always said there was something off about her, too polished by half. Her customer nodded, but her eyes darted nervously, and I wondered if she feared her own secrets might surface next. I passed the tea room, its sign now permanently turned to closed, though Sarah had opened the door to air it out. She was sweeping the floor, her movements slow, her face etched with grief. "Mr. Langley," she said, pausing, "is it true about Miss Morton, that she killed Clara?" "It's true," I said gently. "She confessed to the murder and the letters. Clara's debt pushed her too far." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Clara was so kind, lending money when I needed it. I can't believe it ended like this." She turned away, and I left her to her sorrow, the ledger's weight in my memory. Clara's generosity had been her undoing, a bitter irony that stung. At the church, Mr. Tate was tending the graveyard, clipping grass around the stones. His spectacles glinted as he looked up, his face weary but relieved. "Miss Marple was a godsend," he said, leaning on his shears. "Agnes and we thought those letters would never stop. But Helen, it's hard to fathom. Did you suspect her?" I asked, curious. He shook his head. "Not once. She was always kind, helping with church teas. But I suppose we never really know people, do we?" His words echoed Miss Marple's insights about human nature, and I nodded, moving on to the vicarage. Miss Marple was in the garden, tying up dahlias, her straw hat shielding her from the sun. Her hands were steady, but her eyes held a quiet sadness, the mark of one who'd seen too many tragedies. "Mr. Langley," she said, smiling faintly, "you've come to see how Ashby Green fares, I expect. It's a sombre day, isn't it?" I sat on a bench beside her, the air sweet with earth and blooms. "Sombre, but necessary," I said. "Helen's arrest has shaken everyone. I saw Sarah. She's heartbroken, and Mr. Tate's still reeling. How did you know it was Helen, truly?" Miss Marple set down her twine, her fingers brushing a petal. "It was a matter of patterns, Mr. Langley. The letters were too personal, too calculated to be random spite. They served a purpose, to distract, to confuse." Helen's debt to Clara, noted in the ledger, was a motive, but it was her behaviour that confirmed it. Her polished grief, her hasty exit from the social, her access to the typewriter and cyanide through her brother's surgery. These were threads, and they wove a net, I marvelled at her precision, like a weaver at a loom. "But the cyanide," I said. "How did she get it? Dr. Morton's supplies?" "Likely," she said. "Edward Morton is a careless man, overwhelmed by his practice. Cyanide, though rare, can linger in old medical stocks, mislabelled or forgotten. Helen, living in the surgery, would know where to look. And Clara's tea, a daily ritual, was the perfect vehicle. The pills were a flourish to sell the suicide." Her explanation was chilling in its clarity. "And the other suspects?" I asked. "Ned Carter, Lydia Brent. They seemed plausible too." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, they were distractions, Mr. Langley, as the letters intended. Ned's temper is too blunt, his life too open for such cunning. Lydia Brent is solitary, but her silence is self-protection, not guilt. I spoke with her yesterday. She's had her own troubles, but no typewriter, no motive. The village needed scapegoats, and the letters provided them. I thought of Ned, hammering at the smithy, and Lydia, hidden behind her curtains. They were free, but the village's suspicion had marked them. What happens to Dr. Morton? I asked, losing his sister, his reputation. Miss Marple's expression softened. A tragedy, I'm afraid. Edward Morton is a good man, but weak, too trusting. He'll carry this shame, and his practice may not recover. I saw him this morning, walking to the surgery, his shoulders bowed. But he'll endure. People do in their way. Her words were a reminder of Ashby Green's resilience. Yet I felt a pang for Dr. Morton. Blindsided by his sister's betrayal, I asked about the letter's impact, the village's healing. They've stopped, thank goodness, she said. The typewriter is in police custody, and Helen's confession has closed that chapter. But trust is harder to mend. Mrs. Fowler will gossip, Mr. Tate will preach forgiveness, and Sarah will carry Clara's memory. It's a slow mending, but it will come. I nodded, picturing the village knitting itself back together, stitch by painful stitch. You've done a great service, I said. Edith wants to host you for tea to thank you. Miss Marple's smile was warm. That's kind, Mr. Langley. I'll come before I return to St. Mary Mead. But my part was small. People's actions reveal themselves if one watches closely. I left the vicarage, her humility a contrast to her brilliance. The village was stirring, its rhythm returning, though tempered by loss. At the Dog and Whistle, Mr. Gibbs was polishing glasses, his scarred hand steady. "No more letters," he said, catching my eye. "Thanks to that old lady. Never thought I'd say it, but she's sharper than a tack." I smiled, agreeing silently. Ned Carter was at a table, his cap off, his face less guarded. He nodded to me, a rare gesture, and I sensed he felt the village's weight lifting. Lydia, Brent's cottage, as I passed, had one curtain drawn back, a sliver of light suggesting she, too, was rejoining the world. The surgery was quiet, its brass plate dull in the sunlight. I saw Dr. Morton through the window, writing at his desk, his movements slow. I didn't disturb him, but I wished him strength, knowing his road would be long. The tea room, I learned, would reopen under Sarah's care, a tribute to Clara's legacy, and I vowed to visit, to keep her memory alive. That afternoon, I stopped by the churchyard, where Clara's grave was marked by a simple stone, fresh flowers at its base. I stood there, the wind rustling the yews, and thought of her kindness, her trust in Helen, her life cut short by fear. The poison pen had silenced her, but Miss Marple had given her justice, and for that I was grateful. Edith's tea for Miss Marple was set for the next day, and I helped her prepare, polishing the cottage's modest silver, arranging roses from the garden. The village was calm, its storm past, but I knew its scars would remain. At the post office, I overheard Mrs. Fowler, her tone softer, speaking of a fund for Clara's memorial. She was the heart of this place, she said, and I saw tears in her eyes, a rare crack in her gossip's armour. The tea was a quiet affair, the parlour warm with sunlight, the table laden with Edith's best efforts, scones, jam, a sponge cake dusted with sugar. Miss Marple arrived in her usual tweeds, her knitting bag at her side, her smile a balm. "What a lovely spread, Miss Langley," she said, taking a seat. "You've outdone yourself." Edith blushed, a rare sight. "It's the least we could do," she said. "You've saved Ashby Green, Miss Marple. Those letters, Clara's, death, we'd have been lost without you." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes crinkling. "Oh, I did very little. People reveal themselves, you know, in their words, their glances. Helen's fear was her undoing, and Clara's ledger was her voice from beyond. I merely listened." I marvelled at her modesty, knowing her listening had cracked a case that baffled us all. We spoke of lighter things, St. Mary Mead, Edith's garden, my plans to return to journalism. But Clara's shadow lingered, a reminder of why we'd gathered. As Miss Marple rose to leave, she paused, her hand on my arm. "You've a good heart, Mr. Langley," she said. "Keep asking questions, but don't let them steal your peace." Her words stayed with me as I walked her to the vicarage. The village bathed in evening light, its cottages glowing like embers. The green was alive again, children chasing a ball, women chatting by the well. The poison pen was gone, its venom drained, but Ashby Green was changed, its innocence tempered by truth. At Rose Cottage, Edith was clearing the table, her face softer than I'd seen in weeks. "She's remarkable," she said, stacking plates, "like a librarian who sees through walls." I laughed, the sound unfamiliar after so much tension. "She is, and we're lucky she came to Ashby Green." That night I sat by the window, the village dark beyond the glass, its silence a comfort rather than a threat. I thought of Clara, her tea-room's warmth, of Helen, her life now a cell, of Dr. Morton, facing his sister's shame, and of Miss Marple, whose quiet strength had righted a wrong. Ashby Green would heal, its scars a testament to resilience, and I knew I'd carry its lessons with me, wherever my path led. The next day, Miss Marple left for St. Mary Mead, her dear niece Margaret waving from the vicarage gate. I watched her go, a small figure in tweed, her knitting bag swinging, and felt a pang of loss. She'd seen Ashby Green's heart, its flaws and its courage, and left it better than she found it. As I turned back to Rose Cottage, the sun rose higher, casting long shadows that seemed, for the first time, to promise light. Chapter 10. Quiet Returns. The storm that had swept through Ashby Green, stirred by Clara Henshaw's murder and the poison pen letters, had finally passed, leaving the village to gather its scattered pieces under a tentative spring sky. Helen, Morton's arrest, her confession to poisoning Clara and crafting the vicious letters, had lanced the boil of suspicion. but the healing was slow, like a wound that itched even as it closed. I, Robert Langley, found myself changed by the ordeal. My journalist's eye sharpened, but my heart heavy with the cost of truth. Rose Cottage, where my sister Edith and I had weathered the crisis, stood as a quiet sentinel, its thatched roof a reminder of the refuge we'd sought and the secrets we'd uncovered. Miss Jane Marple, whose gentle probing had unravelled the mystery, had left an indelible mark. Her departure for St. Mary Mead a bittersweet note in the village's recovery. It was a week since Helen's confession, and Ashby Green was stirring, back to life, its lanes alive with the hum of daily routines. The morning was soft, the air carrying the scent of damp earth and budding lilacs, a promise of renewal that felt both fragile and fierce. I woke early, my leg less troublesome in the milder weather, and found Edith in the garden, pruning roses with a vigour that spoke of her need to mend what had been broken. Her face, once taut with worry, had softened, though her eyes still held a trace of the fear that had gripped us during the letter's reign. "You're up early," she said, glancing over her shoulder, her shears snipping a wilted bloom. "Thinking of Clara or Miss Marple?" "Both," I admitted, leaning on the garden gate. "And the village. It's trying to move on, but it's not the same. Helen's betrayal, Clara's death, it's left a mark." Edith nodded, brushing dirt from her hands. "It has. But people are resilient, Robert. Look at Sarah. She's reopening the tea room next week, calling it Clara's Cup. And Mr. Tate's planning a service for unity. Even Mrs. Fowler's toned down her gossip, if you can believe it. Her smile was wry, a sign her humour was returning, and I felt a warmth for her strength, a quiet anchor through our ordeal. I decided to walk the village, to see its healing for myself. The green was bathed in sunlight, its grass a vivid emerald, where children chased a hoop, their laughter a balm after weeks of hushed voices. The war memorial, its stone weathered but proud, seemed to stand taller, as if acknowledging the village's survival. I paused there, tracing the carved names, and thought of Clara, whose kindness had been her undoing. Her grave, adorned with fresh flowers, was a silent vow that she'd not be forgotten. At the grocer's, Mrs. Fowler was arranging apples, her chatter subdued but not silenced. "Mr. Langley," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's a relief, isn't it? No more letters, no more fear. Though I'll miss Clara's scones, Sarah's got big shoes to fill." Her tone was kinder than before, and I sensed a genuine sorrow beneath her usual bluster. "Have people forgiven Helen?" I asked, curious about the village's heart. She sighed, stacking tins. "Forgiven? Not yet. Pitied, maybe. Dr. Morton's, the one they feel for. Poor man, losing his sister like that. He's keeping the surgery open, but he's a shadow of himself." Her words painted a picture of a village grappling with loss, and I nodded, moving on to the church, where Mr. Tate was polishing the brass font, his spectacles fogged with effort. "Mr. Langley," he said, straightening, "you're a welcome sight. We're planning that service I mentioned, a chance to come together. Miss Marple's work gave us that, you know. She saw what we couldn't." His gratitude was heartfelt, and I felt a pang for Miss Marple's absence, her quiet genius, a light we'd taken for granted. "Did you ever suspect Helen?" I asked, leaning on a pew. He shook his head, his hands still. "Never. She was always there, helping with flowers, smiling at services, but I suppose that's how evil hides, in plain sight. Agnes says we must pray for her soul, but it's hard. His honesty was raw, a reflection of Ashby Green's struggle to reconcile justice with mercy. I left the church and headed for the tea-room, its windows now gleaming, a sign of Sarah's determination. She was inside, arranging new curtains, her face brighter than I'd seen in weeks. "Mr. Langley," she said, beckoning me in, "come see. I'm making it Clara's again. Her recipes, her spirit. It's what she'd want." The room smelled of fresh paint and hope, its tables set with Clara's old china. I admired Sarah's resolve, a young woman stepping into a void. "You're doing her proud," I said. "Any trouble with the village or memories?" She hesitated, then smiled. "Some whisper, but most are kind. Clara's ledger helped. You know, I settled her debts, small ones mostly, except Helen's. That's gone now, with her arrest. I just wish Clara could see this." Her voice caught, and I squeezed her hand, moved by her courage. As I left, I passed the surgery, its brass plate dulled by neglect. Dr. Morton was in the garden, raking leaves, his movements slow, his face etched with a grief that went beyond words. I called out a greeting, and he nodded, but his eyes were distant, as if he saw only the wreckage of his sister's choices. I didn't linger, sensing his need for solitude, but I hoped time would ease his burden. The village hall, once a stage for the inquest and the social, was quiet, its typewriter now with the police, its role in the letters a dark chapter closed. I paused there, remembering the night of Miss Marple's trap, the tension that had crackled like static. Ned Carter was nearby, mending a bench, his cap pushed back, his face less guarded. "Langley," he said, nodding. "Heard you helped. Catch her. Good work." "Not me," I said, smiling. "Miss Marple. She saw through the letters, the lies." He grunted, hammering a nail. "Smart lady. I got blamed, you know, but I'm clear now. Village feels different, cleaner." His words were gruff but sincere, a sign he'd found his place again. I wished him well, glad the cloud over him had lifted. Lydia Brent's cottage was my next stop, its garden still wild, but its curtains open, a change from her usual seclusion. I knocked and she answered, her tall frame softened by a rare smile. "Mr. Langley," she said, "come in. I've tea on, if you don't mind a simple brew." Surprised, I accepted, stepping into a parlour cluttered with fabrics and sketches, her seamstress's life laid bare. We spoke of the village, and she admitted her relief. "I kept to myself," she said, pouring tea, "because people judge what they don't understand. Those letters, they made me a target, but Miss Marple saw I was no killer. I'm grateful, though I never told her. Her candour was unexpected, and I saw her not as a suspect, but as a woman who'd weathered her own storms." "Why stay, if it's been hard?" I asked, sipping the strong tea. She shrugged, her eyes distant. "It's home, flaws and all. Like a worn dress. You mend it, you don't throw it out." Her metaphor resonated, a mirror to Ashby Green's spirit, and I left with a newfound respect for her resilience. By afternoon, I was at the vicarage, drawn to Miss Marple's lingering influence. Margaret, her niece, welcomed me, her cheer a contrast to the village's sombre mood. "Aunt Jane's back in St. Mary Mead," she said, offering biscuits. "But she wrote yesterday, asking about you and Edith." She said Ashby Green would find its way, and I think she's right. We sat in the parlour, its chintz and china reminder of Miss Marple's presence. "How did she do it?" I asked. "See through Helen when we were all blind?" Margaret laughed, a bright sound. "Aunt Jane sees people, Mr. Langley, their habits, their fears. She said Helen's charm was a mask, her debt a pressure point. The letters were a game to hide the murder, but Aunt Jane plays games better. Her pride was infectious." And I smiled, picturing Miss Marple's knitting needles clicking through the mystery. I asked about the village's future, and Margaret was optimistic. "The service will help," she said. "Mr. Tate's calling. It a renewal, not just for Clara, but for everyone. And Sarah's tea room, it's a start. Ashby Green's tough, like an old oak." Her words stayed with me as I walked home. The village glowing in the late light, its cottages like lanterns against the hills. At Rose Cottage, Edith was in the kitchen, a letter from Cheltenham in her hand, her face thoughtful. "Thinking of going back?" I asked, noting her expression. "Maybe," she said, folding the letter, "but not yet. Ashby Green's grown on me, scars and all. And you, Robert? Back to London, chasing stories?" I hesitated, the question cutting deeper than I expected. "Not sure," I said. "This place has taught me something. About truth, about people. I might stay a while, write about it." The idea had been brewing. A book about Ashby Green's ordeal, not for sensationalism, but to honour Clara, Miss Marple, and the village's heart. Edith smiled, a rare softness. "You do it justice. Just don't make me the heroine. I'm too prickly for that." We laughed. The sound a bridge to lighter days, and I felt the cottage settle around us, a home despite its trials. The renewal service was held that Sunday. The church packed with villagers, their faces a mix of sorrow and hope. Mr. Tate spoke of forgiveness, of rebuilding trust, his voice steady despite his own wounds. Sarah sat in the front, her head high, Clara's memory a light in her eyes. Dr. Morton was absent, but I heard he'd sent flowers, a silent apology for his sister's deeds. Mrs. Fowler wept quietly, her handkerchief a flag of truce, while Ned Carter and Lydia Brent sat in the back, their presence a sign of reconciliation. Afterward, the village gathered on the green, sharing tea and stories, a communal exhale after weeks of holding breath. I stood by the memorial, watching the children play, the women laugh, the men nod over pipes. Ashby Green was mending, its roots deep enough to weather the storm. Clara's absence was a void, but her legacy, Sarah's tea room, the memorial fund, filled it with meaning. That evening, I wrote to Miss Marple a letter of thanks and reflection, sealed with a promise to visit St. Mary Mead. As I posted it, the village was quiet, its lights winking like stars. Rose Cottage welcomed me back, its warmth a contrast to the cold fear we'd known. Edith was reading, her face calm, and I knew we'd carry Ashby Green with us, its lessons etched in our bones. I sat by the window, the night soft beyond the glass, and thought of Miss Marple, her knitting a metaphor for her work, stitching truth from chaos. Ashby Green was whole again, its quiet a hard-won peace, and I was grateful to have witnessed its journey, guided by a woman who saw the world's heart and loved it still.